Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's University Business web seminar, which is entitled Four Higher Ed Financial Technology Trends for 2021 and Beyond, which is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, Syntellis. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to share just a few housekeeping items with all of you today. For technical support, please use the chat panel, which you can find on the right side of your screen. Then select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and then type your message if you're having any technical issues, and I should get to you shortly. If you don't have any computer speakers, or maybe you prefer listening privately, then please dial the phone number and access code that I'll be posting in the chat window in a few moments, so look out for that. Today, we'll also be welcoming any questions that any of you have with a Q&A session, which will take place at the very end of the presentation. To submit a question, please use the Q&A panel, which you can find at the bottom right side of your screen. And then just send your questions to all panelists, which should be the default option. If for whatever reason you don't see the chat or the Q&A panels, just again, look to the right side of your screen and then click on the expand triangle, which is located directly in front of the panel name to make sure you have access to it. Also, one last thing, something important to note, if you would like to access the web seminar at a later time, you'd be pleased to know that everyone who registered and who is attending today will receive an email with a link to the slide as well as an archive recording. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to all of you our speakers today. We have Phil Chick. Phil is the Chief Business Officer at Xavier University, as well as Vice President of Financial Administration there. And we also have Logan Anderson, who is the Senior Solutions Engineer at Syntellis. Phil and Logan, it's great to have you with us today. We really appreciate it, you guys.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate you introducing us. So today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on some of the results from the annual survey we do here at Syntellis and that we share with the higher education community. And so what we're going to be trying to do is identify trends that we see going forward in the market specific to higher education. Today, I have the esteemed pleasure of having Phil Chick from Xavier University joining me. Phil, do you mind just taking a moment and introducing yourself, and then I'll give a little bit about my background as well.
Great, thanks, Logan. Good afternoon, everybody. As Logan and Stephen said, my name is Phil Chick. I'm the Chief Business Officer here at Xavier University in Cincinnati. You can see a little bit about my bio on the screen. Just a little bit about Xavier, too, to put some of what I'll mention later in context. We have about 5,000 undergrads, full-time undergrads, and about 1,700 full and part-time graduate students with an annual budget of about $200 million. We're a tuition-dependent institution, and we have about 1,000 employees. So that at least gives you some context of how big we are, and when you hear my comments, you'll be able to relate to some of what we've gone through.
Well, thanks, Phil. Yeah, and I'm Logan Anderson, again, Senior Solutions Engineer here at Syntellis. I've been with the company a little over 4 years, but most of that time was actually in our services group, where I was a practice lead, and I led implementations at universities nationwide, large public, small privates, community colleges, what have you. So I try to bring all that experience to bear here. Also, before joining the company, I was at the University of Notre Dame, where I spent 8 years. Spent my first 2 years there in a really small program that was all grant funded, restricted funded, and I did work in Haiti. And then I did most of my time there was in the central budget office, where I managed the university's budget process, budget tools, and actually led an EPM implementation while I was there. So try to remember sort of what it was like being on that side of the table as well. And I also had the pleasure of working with Phil and his team when we implemented the long-range planning solution at Xavier. So just high-level agenda today. I'm going to talk real quick about the trends, some background on the survey, but then we're going to try and double-click down into sort of each trend that we've identified. I really want to also get Phil's perspective here, someone that's in your shoes, talking to peers and the like. So the the high level trends that we've seen, oh, sorry, I went too far there. You know, a couple things that we want to focus on here when we think about the context of 2021, right? So we take a perspective here from Moody's, right, a rating agency, to see how they're viewing the, you know, the vertical from Centellis's perspective, but the market from a higher ed perspective from a high level. So they're expecting revenue declines of 5 to 10%. Public and private institutions won't generate cash margins above 10%. I don't think anyone on the phone that's going to come as any big surprise, given what 2020 was like and some uncertainty around 2021. But the trends that we see coming out of this survey were really kind of four at a high level. One is being action oriented. So we think about making data informed decisions, right? Not just data driven decisions. I think Phil and I are going to talk about this a little bit more a little bit later on, but you also need to be agile, right? And so you got to be able to respond quickly as events happen in the market or external factors or internal factors. You've got to have the agility to react and respond, and hopefully to be proactive as well. In order to be agile, I think you've got to be efficient. So there are so many within the Office of Finance, you know, all the institutions we work with, there are so many sort of low value add tasks that the staff are required to do, and they're necessary, but they're time intensive, they're manual, and we need to start automating those in the Office of Finance. So those individuals putting all that time and effort in can start really stop trying to figure out what happened and start talking about what's going to happen next. And the last is really making sure you've got advanced modeling tools. So the pandemic certainly showed us that you've got to be able to do a lot of what if scenarios. And so I'm going to talk to Phil a little bit about what his institution went through and get his perspective as well. A little bit more background about the survey itself. You know, who responded. So we have 100 higher education finance professionals. So this is just focused on higher ed, just focused on people in the finance roles. As you can see here, the primary respondents were 4-year public and privates. We had some community colleges respond as well, and even some for-profit universities, and then a fairly nice cross section in terms of sort of the size of the universities as well that responded. So I do think that this represents a pretty good survey. It also, this survey took place between September and November of 2020. So at that point, you know, institutions had a pretty good idea where fall enrollment landed, where they're starting to project cash reserves, those kind of things. So that's sort of the underlying context that people were viewing this in. So we talk about being action oriented, right? So this is two of the stats from the survey here. The first one here really stood out to me because, you know, 75% of the professionals that responded to this survey felt like they could do more to leverage financial and operational data to inform strategy. So Phil, we talked about this a little bit in advance, right? This idea of sort of difference between being data driven and data informed. Can you talk about how you think about that at your institution at Xavier?
Yeah, we've gone through what I think the respondents here have gone through, realizing that we had a wealth of both financial and operational data that we really hadn't been using to make some of our forward-looking decisions, or we used it in an ad hoc way. And when we did that, we presented data as it was without really providing the context. Just because it took us sometimes so long to get the data that we needed. So that's something we're continuing to work on. But like, you know, a lot of folks, you know, in our industry that have had to deal with budget pressure and cost cuts and things like that, what we've really tried to do, and it really comes from the top at our organization, but I carry this flag along with our provost and others, is using that data, getting more data, but not being blind to what other information that data is telling us. I think the risk we run in our roles is if we're only focused on gathering the data, we need to have that time to step back and say, what does this data really mean? We're also a private institution, a Catholic institution, so we have a lot of mission-oriented programs and non-academic work that we do that we also have to consider. So that I think affects our thinking. But it becomes a balance of being able to quickly get at the data, so that you can spend some time analyzing it. And that, I think, leads to the other point that we've talked about, Logan, was time as really one of our most valuable resources too.
Yep. Yeah. I think, so many folks, when they think about resources at a university, you're looking at resource allocation, right? So you're looking at financial resource allocation, human resource allocation, physical capital resource allocation. But that forgotten resource, to your point, is time, right? And so the more that you've done that analysis sort of ahead of time, that you've communicated with leadership, that, sort of, we knew we obviously didn't know the pandemic was coming, but at some point we knew it was gonna impact fall, right? So if you start prepping leadership that, hey, what happens if we miss our revenue projections by 5%, by 7%? What levers do we have? The more you've agreed upon, sort of proactively put action plans in place, you can implement those strategies quicker, and being able to implement them quicker, right? Doesn't it allow you then to be able to save on those other resources? Is that a fair
I'll add to that. That's exactly the situation we found ourselves in over the summer. We got through the spring okay. We had to refund a fair amount of money for people who went home and room and board and the like, but we didn't want to repeat in the fall. So we spent a fair amount of time over the summer determining exactly what those levers were. And then we've been able to use that model as we've gone forward through the summer and the winter. And now things seem like we're on pretty stable ground, but it took us a monumental amount of work to start that process. But now it's something that we've been able to build and use. But the time was the valuable resource there. We were able to act quickly enough, though, that we didn't have any problems.
Right. And the second stat here, I think, kind of reinforces that idea of time, right? So 57% of institutions or professionals, don't believe they have the right tools to respond quickly to budgeting and financial planning changes. One of the things that you just said, Phil, or a little bit ago, was sort of that access to data. When, most, in my experience, people in your role in your office have pretty good access to the financial data, but then it's HR or position data, and then student data also that is critical to understanding the finances. Sort of, what's your experience and sort of access to that data? Is that something that takes you a while to bring together, and those kind of things?
Yeah, in our case, given our size, we have personal relationships with most of the data owners across campus, so we can make a phone call and that sort of thing to get what we need. But admittedly, that's not ideal. That's not ideal because, as we learned during the pandemic, they were as busy as we were trying to manage their own areas, enrollment management being the primary one. They were trying to make sure we could bring in the class. They were trying to make sure we were aiding students properly in a very, very difficult time. So what it taught us, and we haven't yet progressed too far down this path, though, what it's really started to highlight for us, though, is how do we begin to integrate that data across the institution? So it's not only available for us, but it's available for other decision makers who may need that data, such as deans or department chairs. So it did highlight that, though, pretty significantly, because prior to the pandemic, we lived with that time delay. We lived with, well, I'll get back to you in a week, I'll get back to you next month. And between March and May of 2020, that was not a luxury that many of us had. So, and unfortunately, our size was an advantage there because we did have the personal relationships.
Great. No, I appreciate that perspective, and I think that'll resonate with our audience as well. So when we at Centellus, when we think about how you can transform your institution to make more data informed decisions, one, Phil hit on it, you've got to be able to integrate data for quick access. So that's one of the things that we try to harp on is bringing all our data sets into the solution, making sure you've got one platform then, right, to report on that data. So you've got to have the tools then to, once you have the data in, to analyze it. The cloud, actually having a cloud-based solution has been huge for a lot of our clients, so that you've got access anywhere to your data, right? You don't have to be on premise. You don't have to necessarily VPN. You can log in and authenticate in from anywhere you need to. Institute data governance practices is huge. Is sort of, I can't tell you how many institutions we run into, and sort of an org or a department means something different to across campus, right? Or a certain term. So making sure you've got strong data governance practices and people are booking to the right expense accounts and revenue accounts and those kind of things. And then create a culture to sort of support that, right? And I think Phil hit on that as well. You've got to sort of start showing some of that data across campus and sharing it so that people understand sort of where you're coming from a leadership perspective. So the second trend we really saw, right, is the ability, the need to be agile, right? So we've got to be nimble to do that. And I think, these statistics really kind of stood out to me, and that, institutions, and I don't think anyone was prepared for the pandemic, right? We weren't, no one was ready for that. But still, I mean, the numbers are pretty remarkable here. 15% weren't prepared for budget, financial planning, and reporting technology. They didn't feel very prepared to communicate to faculty and staff, or to have that technology to deliver online learning. So, in order to be agile, though, you've got to have some of those solutions to help you be nimble. The other stat here that we've got is sort of enrollment impact, right? And so based on the outcomes of our survey, roughly 51% saw enrollment decrease. About 29% was flat, 20% increased, but also this had a big impact on cash reserve. Not only because enrollment and auxiliary revenues were down, but also because there were costs. There were investments that needed to be made to transform the university to go online as well. So Phil, any thoughts here on sort of how you've evaluated enrollment and also cash in this environment?
Yeah, so we were fortunate that our enrollment actually was pretty solid last fall, and actually a little bit ahead of expectations after we calibrated everything. But we were, like a lot of schools, concerned over the summer about our cash and liquidity position, not because we necessarily started out in a lean place, but the thing that was in the back of our mind is what happens if we have to send students home. And we were fortunate. We went to a hybrid model, fully residential, but a hybrid model where some of the classes were online, and all classes were both online and in person, but we alternated students. But we were worried we'd have to send everybody home. So one of the new practices we developed is we enhanced our cash forecasting capability, so that we could outlook, like you referred to earlier, Logan, we could outlook and look ahead and say, if we had to send people home on this day, or if we had to shut down on this day, what would it cost us to get through the term if we had to refund money? And that was a process we put in place right around, over the summer last year. And then every month now we just update that. Now, the good news is we think we're out of the woods, knock on wood. But it forced us to really take a hard look at more near-term financial outlook than we had ever adopted before. We used to just look at kind of an annual cycle.
Right.
So yeah, it was something that we've adopted and are going to continue to do now because we've got it built into our DNA from a processing standpoint.
And so you said you looked
spreadsheet, though, by the way, I should say, still on a spreadsheet. I will admit that.
We'll have to talk to you about that, but well, the spreadsheets are always going to have some place within finance, right? So, but when you think about that, though, I'm kind of curious. You said you went on you used to be on an annual basis. It sounds like you're on monthly. Are you going down any more granularly than that?
No, from a cash forecasting standpoint, we actually look at liquidity reports every week now, which are easy to get. We just pull our bank data, but we're rolling forward every week what we expect expenditures to be. When's payroll going to hit? When are the big construction expenditures going to hit? And we look out on 2 months now. And then we then look out over the course of the whole academic term separately. So it's also allowed us to just be a little bit better cash managers too, although there's not much interest to be found anywhere anyway.
Oh, yeah.
That'll serve us well if interest rates ever do go back up again. So
yeah, no, that's a great point. The other trend that we saw, and I think kind of predicted as part of going into the pandemic, was this need to sort of refocus or spend more time on in-year forecasting. And I think you're kind of getting that as well here. I mean, it's not quite the same as cash forecasting here, but this 2019 survey, for example, here is in the sort of magenta color, and the 2020 is in the blue. So, 2019, 23% of institutions weren't doing sort of in-year forecasting. We think of in-year forecasting as taking our actuals, to a certain point in time, and then projecting out how we're going to finish the year. And so in 2020, only 6%. So a huge change. And we also saw a huge uptick in the frequency, right? So people used to just do it once or twice a year, and now doing it 3 to 4 times a year. Some institutions are also now doing it more frequently on a monthly basis. So one of the things as part of our budgeting solution we've rolled out is that ability to sort of support that in-year forecasting as well, right? And that's absolutely, I think, a tool and functionality that is needed within the market. Phil, at Xavier, can you talk a little bit about your forecasting process? And I know we talked, you do a couple different methods.
Yeah, so this is one where we'd been talking, I've been here about 3 years now, and we've been talking about, do we need to do a more frequent forecast? And we had started to kind of think through what we were doing. We traditionally had done it 2 times a year. We would only really do a fall forecast if our enrollment was a big miss up or down. And then we would do a hard look at the end of the second quarter, December, we're June 30 year end. We do a hard look at the end of the second quarter, focused primarily on expenses and possibly on enrollment retention, but those numbers were in a pretty narrow band. And that was a kind of a twice a year look. We would look at it in the end of the beginning of the year just to make sure revenue was good. And then we look at it again in December, and then we didn't really touch it unless we had a major expense problem or something that we knew about. We made the shift this year to do full quarterly forecasting. And the reason we did that was, again, pandemic related, but it also was really an important part of what we had to do in our cash flow forecast. So our cash flow forecast that I mentioned a minute ago, we felt couldn't be as accurate as it needed to be unless we had done a deep dive on the expense side of our ledger. And that's really what we focus on. Our revenue does tend to stay in a pretty narrow band once the class comes in, but we're always worried about expenses. So we are one of those schools that move to that quarterly. It's not a deep dive necessarily at the account level, except in areas of large expenditure. We're really doing it at the divisional level and the major operating unit level. But there are some large expense areas that we pay close attention to as well. So.
Right. And I think you mentioned you go deep in one of the forecasts, and then a couple of the others are a little bit more high level. Are you distributing? Who's all involved in that process? Are you distributing it out, or is it mainly within your office?
Yes. So we do. We collect them. We do the first dive in our offices, but then in our office, in the budget office, but then we reach out to all the major units and review what we're seeing with them, just verbally. Right. We also then ask them, hey, do you guys, is there anything that you haven't told, that we're not aware of that you're planning in the remaining part of the year? And we do that now. We do that now at the end of every quarter, same exercise. And then when we're done, we obviously report that out to the senior leadership team, the cabinet, and also eventually to the whole campus twice a year. We report out what the forecast looks like. So.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that audience is also key, right? So you're reporting up and then also kind of distributing out as well.
Yes.
So when we, at Centellus, sort of how do we think institutions can be more agile? Well, I think obviously, we're talking about technology here in some regard, but really it's also a process. So you've got to fit this process into the sort of DNA of your institution. So that oftentimes, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, is shifting resources from focusing on the budget to focusing on in-year forecasting and be a little bit more nimble, right? So a little bit of that human resource reallocation from one process to another. We'll talk about, some of the metrics we've seen here in terms of the length of the budget process. Also, want to make sure we're facilitating leadership discussions on resource allocation. That's one of the, we want to look back at the budget, but at some point that budget becomes sort of moot, and we've got to make sure leadership's on board with what we think is going to happen, not what we said was going to happen 6-7 months ago. And then the transparency is also key, right? So you're bringing more people into the fold here and communicating across campus, getting everyone on the same page. So from a technology perspective, obviously you need to be able to reforecast at any interval. So, we can support up to a monthly forecast. Phil's doing it, and his institution is doing it quarterly, but, you might get that ad hoc request from the board to do it, after, the end of February or something like that. You've got to be able to bring that disparate data. We've talked about that already together into a solution, and then support ad hoc reporting as well. So we really think in-year forecasting is going to be a fundamental component of all institutions' sort of planning practices going forward. It's going to be more frequent and more important as we move forward. So Next thing is planning efficiencies, right? So it's as we said early on, it's pretty hard to be nimble and agile if it takes forever to kind of get data in or to seed a scenario or to do a lot of these processes. So one of the stats that stood out from our survey was that 55% say higher education lags other industries in terms of adoption of modern budgeting and financial planning tools. I think that's about right, but Phil, any perspective on that statistic?
Yeah, I can't say whether that the percentage is the right percentage, but I
Right.
can say from having spent 25 years in the corporate world before coming to higher ed 11 years ago or so, that that this is absolutely true. Our industry is way behind where other industries are in this regard, and it's just and candidly, it was never really a necessary thing because most institutions were fortunate enough that once they had their class in the fall and the budget was set, maybe even over the summer, that budget never moved that much. And you just kind of rolled the budget forward. But in the environment we're in now, particularly the environment not only coming out of the tail end of the pandemic, hopefully, but also just demographic changes and more competition for students, particularly where we are in the Midwest, we need to be efficient in how we get up-to-date information, planning and budgeting. And I do think the industry is well behind, which is another reason we've moved forward with the tool set we're embarking on now.
Yeah, and I think, right, a lot of that is what this shows, right, is that a lot of the planning processes are happening in Excel still. So 42% of budgeting processes are still in Excel, 49% of forecasting, 53% of tuition, scenario modeling, 56%. Scenario modeling in Excel can be really tough, right? Comparing two different Excel models. So I know that from experience when I was at Notre Dame, and I know it from working with our clients as well. And I think, right, not having these tools in place, over the past 15, 20 years, there's been more constraints on the ability to sort of grow resources through tuition. There's usually, in most institutions, been a more narrow focus on expenses, especially administrative expenses. So finance offices haven't seen huge headcount growth. And then you layer in the pandemic. Now you're asking your finance resources to do more and more and more with less, right? If you don't have the tools in place to support it, then that can lead to burnout, right? Because a lot of this is cumbersome, manual, and time consuming. I know you still do some processes in Excel, and Excel will always be around in finance in some capacity, Phil, but any perspective there on that as a tool?
Yeah, so that, as Logan mentioned earlier, we made the decision about a year or so ago, I can't remember the exact time, to install the Syntellis LRP, the long range planning tool, specifically for the reason of the scenario modeling that Logan mentioned. And what we used to do, like Logan said, is we used to do different scenarios on spreadsheets, and just the time it took to create them and analyze them to make sure they were correct, not to mention the time it took to compare them, was just monumental, and made it very difficult for us to do. So we did make the decision initially to purchase the Syntellis product. We installed it remotely over the summer, as I recall, the spring and the summer. And what it allowed us to do, though, which was just phenomenal this year, because as we were planning this past fall and winter for this upcoming budget cycle that we're in now, we wanted to run a couple different scenarios with different undergraduate enrollment levels because we didn't know what was going to happen with the pandemic and with other things happening in our market. And we were able to run 3 separate 5-year scenarios very, very quickly. And it was a huge time savings for us. And, the biggest regret we had is that we didn't install this tool 5 years ago. But it was huge for us because everything that's mentioned on the right half of this slide is what we found under our old way of doing it. And just the ability, I remember there was in this particular case, I saw the numbers and I went to the staff, I said, hey, instead of assuming this, assume that. And within about an hour, they had a set of new numbers back in front of me, which would have probably taken a week in the old model. So right. It's become a lot more valuable for us. And I think our next step will be to look at these other opportunities in budgeting and forecasting to see where we can gain efficiency there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when you think about efficiencies too, right, what we see in the industry is that the budget cycles are really long. And in this stat, what we were really asking was sort of what's the length of time when you send out, whether it's in Excel, a template to your campus, right? From the time you send it out, ask them to input data, you bring it back, you consolidate it, you review it, you approve it, you present it to the board. What's the length of that cycle? And some of these cycles are, 7 to 9 months, greater than 9 months, 4 to 6 months are just huge. And that's a lot of resources dedicated to that sort of cycle there. And so I think what we're seeing a lot of institutions try to do is shrink down, like we said, shrink down that cycle a little bit, become more efficient there, and then able to redeploy their human resources to more analysis, right? Whether it be long range planning, in-year forecasting, analysis of budget versus actuals, deep dive into spending trends, right? So condensing that cycle down can really help. I know you talked, Phil, we talked before, you guys are kind of in the midst of looking at shrinking that cycle. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so our budget goes to our board in May, and we used to start that it's about a 5 to 6 month cycle here at Xavier, but we're shrinking it down for the reasons you cited, that it took so long, and we didn't have a chance to really dive in and do a lot of what if scenarios within the budget. And so we're in the process of trying to get that down to 1 to 3 months. We're not quite there yet, but a couple of things that we've done prior to the purchase or installation of any new technology is we just asked ourselves, what was where was some of our time spent? Where was most of our time spent in this cycle? And what we learned was we weren't spending a lot of time asking upfront questions about what's going on in your business in athletics or auxiliary services or academic affairs. We were spending a lot of our time sending out spreadsheets and having them send back spreadsheets with a whole bunch of stuff on there. And then when we rolled it into the budget, it either added up or didn't add up. So the change we're making before we look at technology is to say, what can we do to where was the time was being spent in the wrong places. So this year, what we did is we went out to all the units and we said, before we put anything on paper, tell us where you think you need incremental spending. Tell us where you think you are going to be able to reduce spending. Here's what we think. Here's what we think you can reduce. And so to have that dialogue's allowed us hopefully to shrink that cycle. It's the first step in what we hope will be a 1 to 2 year process to get that down to a 2 to 3 month cycle, as opposed to somewhere between 4 to 7 months now. We did a lot of the work, though. I will tell you, we say 4 to 7. We did 30 to 60 days worth of work before the formal kickoff within our division, but it was still work that we had to do. So, but again, having a shorter budget cycle and doing more frequent updates in a forecast type way, I think is going to be the way the industry's moving.
Yeah, I really like that. I don't think you mentioned that before, that sort of pre-collaboration phase that you're having with campus. My bet is that one of the good outcomes, I hope, of that is that collaboration leads to more accountability on their end, right? When you're not just pushing numbers to them, but sort of bringing them in to be part of the conversation, it's going to make them more accountable over the long term. And,
yeah, I think it will. And what we've already learned is it's allowed us to be able to, because we had a very simple process where we said, put on a spreadsheet the large ticket items you think you're going to need additional funding for this year. And as we had those conversations, we had something in front of us, number one, but number two, it allowed us to compare notes with another division. So in one case, we had one division who was adding a resource for something that they wanted to do in the technology space. But we said, well, wait a minute, let's consult with IT. What are they doing in that space? So we haven't made that decision as to where that resource may need to go. But the idea is that we're having that discussion now before we sit there and add up 200 spreadsheets from all over campus. So
right. No, that's really helpful. And then you might be able to have a shared resource and split the costs or something
exactly.
like that, be a little bit more efficient. No, that's great. So at Syntellis, when we think about trying to be more efficient, right, one of the things we want to do with our solution is make sure we're integrating labor data into the operating budget, funding requests, and student data. So that's something we can all integrate, making sure our budget's informed. We also have that underlying position detail that adds up directly to, right, your staff salary costs or the tuition costs, also supporting transfers and those kind of things. And what we talked about is really you've got to be able to reduce those manually intensive processes. So whether it's seeding a scenario, whether that's the budget, right? Are you going to use your permanent budget from last year? Are you going to use actuals from last year? Maybe you want to go zero based or use your most recent forecast to seed the budget next year. You got to have that flexibility and have something that can do it quickly. Distributing the budget templates is also can be kind of a nightmare as well, right? Via email. You don't know where they go. Did they receive them? Did they download them right? Are they breaking your formulas? So that can be difficult. Then consolidating, right? You've got to then take each spreadsheet. A lot of people are putting into some sort of Access database, doing some magic and hoping and praying that number comes out right, and you can upload it back to your ERP. That can take a lot of time. Approving the budget, typically that's an email, and so right there's no recording of the approvals unless you're printing off. A lot of people are printing off the PDF, the emails, right, putting them in a folder and saying everyone's sent the email to approve it. But it's not a great system either. There's not a lot of auditability there. And then validating is the other key component. So within the system, we want to make sure we've got workflow and notifications, both email to notifications, people in-app, to make sure that we're identifying bottlenecks and creating a more efficient process. Advanced modeling then is kind of the next big trend that we're going to see, and that we've been trying to push for a while. And I just think the pandemic and COVID has just sort of really shown a lot of light on it. The ability to do sort of more in-depth scenario modeling within an institution. So, again, according to the survey, 53% plan to use scenario analysis in 2021 to mix and match assumptions. I guess I think that number is low. I think it should be 100%, but that's me. I mean, I don't understand the 47% who aren't really going to try and do this at all. I understand it can be hard even if you don't have a good solution for it, but it's something that I think is critical. So any thoughts here in terms of scenario modeling and the requirements, from your staff at the university?
Yeah, this was an area where, this is an area where we were doing scenario modeling, but it was very isolated. And I'll give you an example. We had a pretty robust tool that we use, an Excel tool that we built that we would use for tuition and auxiliary revenue modeling, room and board modeling, because that's the biggest piece. Being a tuition dependent institution, that's the biggest piece of our revenue. So we had a pretty robust tool that we could use, and we could go in there and play with price increases, and we could play with headcount levels, student headcount levels, and graduate student credit hour levels and whatnot. And we had that tool was pretty good for us. But what it didn't let us do is it really didn't let us look at some of the capacity constraints that we might have in dining or that we might have in beds. It also didn't drive down what some of the expense implications were for those revenue changes. So it was a pretty nice little tool, but we had to do a whole bunch of other work to be able to see the whole picture. So that's what really drove us to look for a solution a couple of years ago. When we started to look for a solution, is we felt pretty comfortable about where we were on the revenue modeling side, but on the but everything else just was just tons and tons and tons of work. And I do agree with you. I thought this number was low, particularly in light of COVID, because even if you aren't going full bore, top line to bottom line analysis, I almost assume you have to be doing some sort of modeling, at least on your major revenue or major expense lines, to be able to say, what if I do this versus this, to that scenario analysis. So I do agree with you, Logan. I thought this number was low, but right. We felt this was really, really critical. And part of what drove this for us was the looming demographic cliff, which most of all of you may have heard about, which is going to be particularly acute here in the Midwest. We wanted to be able to have a tool that let us look out more than a year or so, because our model was good for the current year, but it didn't give us a lot of flexibility in the out years. And that's what really drove us to make the decision to do this more advanced modeling, as you call it.
Right. Yeah, and I remember one of the statistics or one of the metrics that we built into the solution for you, I think, was looking at your ratios of student to faculty and student to staff ratios and those kind of things. And so that's another sort of data point that I know you were looking to get out of and communicate with leadership.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'd forgotten about that. But that was a really critical element for us, because we had we felt we were understaffed in faculty and staff to student ratios for a while, but we made some decisions over the last years to increase our faculty levels. And the question we wanted to ask is if our enrollment plateaued or started to soften a little bit, what impact was that going to have on faculty student ratio levels? And because you need longer lead time to adjust faculty levels if you have to adjust them.
Right.
And so that was a pretty important thing for us. Again, being a small tuition dependent institution, we felt that that was an important thing. The other thing I said, I think I mentioned a minute ago, was we do have some constraints on, residence hall capacity that we had to be conscious of. That our former way of doing it didn't give us that flexibility. Or didn't give us that kind of marker to say, oh, you got to watch out. You guys are out of, you can grow enrollment another 5%, but you don't have any beds. So that was something that was important for us that we couldn't easily do in the old way we did it.
Yeah. The other thing with, the modeling that we're seeing is sort of the time horizon, right? So the folks who are doing it are looking at sort of that 1 to 5 year, less than the 6 to 10. But then, we've got about half the institutions are evaluating strategic initiatives to make go, no-go decisions. When you see these numbers, Phil, what's the time horizon that you're focused on? And I guess the other question I have is sort of the audience. What are they asking for, that you're delivering these scenarios to? What's the time frame they're asking for?
That's a great question. So our primary audience is as our senior leadership team, which are the people that report to our president, and our finance committee and the board. Those are the primary audiences for this particular exercise. We're currently doing a 5-year outlook, but we've already started to discuss going to a 10-year outlook. And this is important for us because we're getting comfortable enough with the 5 years now that we feel that the modeling will make some sense, although the biggest variable is enrollment levels in both cases, both the 5-year and the 10-year outlook. But the reason we felt it was important to begin to consider going longer, like I said, we're not there yet, but we're considering it, is really two things. One was the demographic cliff, which I mentioned. And then the second thing is just given the lead time, if you do need to build a building, whether it's a residence hall or an academic building or something else, you need to know how much lead time you need to have either for fundraising or construction or things like that. And usually those are within a 5-year window, but if that building is not planned for the end of your 5-year cycle, then you've got to figure out what cost impact is in year 6 to 10. The other thing I'll mention here is we didn't have the tool at the time, but one of the things we did use some of our what if analysis to do was to decide a few years ago whether or not to move forward on a new residence hall. And that, we didn't have the tool that we have now, which probably would have made it a ton easier. But my point there is that we would be in that last category as well, where we would be using those what if analysis to make go, no go decisions on program additions or major construction projects, things like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's critical going forward. The other thing, most institutions are focused on the P&L. I know you moved recently or you're moving towards budgeting on a GAAP basis, and one of the things the solution comes with is a balance sheet, projecting out a balance sheet. So I think we feel like that's best practice as well, right? Not just looking at sort of on the budget basis and on a cash basis, those are obviously critical, but understanding sort of the impact of the total change in that assets, how that impacts the balance sheet, looking at debt, capital, to your point. Has that changed at all how leadership reviews sort of these analyses and what if scenarios and the questions they ask?
That was another thing we liked about the tool, but admittedly we didn't focus that part of our effort this go around on that part of the tool. But it is something that we are looking at very closely because of what you just mentioned. The balance sheet is also important in credit ratings and things like that going forward. So this was really the first go round of detailed scenario analysis, but it is important to us and will be something we roll into our thinking as we move forward. What we did, and I don't know if this is unusual, but I would imagine most schools with staff our size, or that don't have a huge staff, will do what we did, which is we got our scenarios done for kind of our preview, our preliminary targets for target setting for the budget, so that the first year, that 5-year outlook, became our targets for the budget. Now we're focused on building that budget. And then once that's done in April, May timeframe, we'll go back and update the long range outlook for whatever the budget ends up being.
Right.
That's at a time, Logan, where we'll likely take a deeper dive into the balance sheet.
Right. No,
I don't want to minimize its importance, but I do think in our case in particular, we felt comfortable enough with liquidity and what was on our balance sheet. We didn't need any debt or anything, that we could kind of tuck that away this time and take a deeper dive into that next fall after we get the summer fall, after we get the budget done.
Well, I think just explain. Yeah, I think also explaining to leadership and to credit agencies or rating agencies that you have that level of sophistication in your planning, right, is also key in terms of their outlook on your ability to sort of react to different changes.
Yeah.
So when we think about scenario modeling, right, we think, obviously we talked about it, we've got to use technology, trying to do this in Excel, and then you can usually build a version of a spreadsheet here and then another version of the spreadsheet in another spreadsheet, but then comparing those two scenarios in Excel can be really difficult, right? To do that dynamically can be difficult. Also, incorporating some dependencies in your models. So I think Phil hit on it a little bit in terms of being able to look at capital over different time horizons, and the impact on cash and on the balance sheet is important. Being able to sort of understand those ratios, so the student to faculty ratios as well, building in dependencies in terms of as you raise and increase salaries, the impact on benefits. The other thing this advanced modeling allows you to do is identify and communicate to leadership the levers that you have at your disposal. So much of what I heard back from clients and the market was that, especially with COVID, that they felt like that top side, right, they didn't have a lot of control in enrollment this go around. So not really sure what was going to happen there, but then their levers are really the expense, right, looking at what happens if we cut travel, what if we suspend 403B matches, those kind of things, and then how much sort of wiggle does that give us? So having that ability and doing that analysis ahead of time really helps. We advise building out just sort of the base case or the status quo scenario, so that you've got kind of a baseline over a 5 to 10 year time horizon, that then as you model in different initiatives, as you model in aggressive strategies, you get to sort of see how you go above and below that line. Want to make sure we're using historical trends also to inform drivers. So that's really important, that you're sort of being realistic about your projections. Also identifying what leadership is really looking for. So one thing that Phil and his team really identified was those metrics of student to faculty, student to staff ratios, and then don't get caught up in the minutiae. So when it comes to sort of long range planning, we're doing it at a high level. We're not talking about, right, what's it going to be for a new exhibition that's going to cost $20,000. We're talking about large scale initiatives and those kind of things as well. So looking ahead, a couple of the statistics here that kind of, we want to make sure that we think this reflects that institutions are hopeful but realistic. So 62% of finance leaders believe their institutions will be financially stable for the next 5+ years. I guess, but the flip side of that, right, is 38% aren't so certain, and that's a pretty telling statistic, I think, given where we're at. And then 49% think they will return to nearly normal in the next 12 to 18 months. That number seems a little bit high to me. Anything jump out to you there, Phil, in terms of those numbers?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised by the first number, but I did think the second number was a little high. But I guess the qualifier there is nearly normal. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
I don't know. Define normal. What I've said to our leadership and our board and others here is, we were in the early stages of planning for the demographic cliff and some of the enrollment challenges that we see ahead, particularly in the Midwest, like I said. So we were in the early stages of those discussions and planning. And what I think really happened was, I think the COVID pandemic brought those challenges to the forefront. They brought them from some point down the road a few miles right to the windshield. And I think what also happened then is it's not only caused the enrollment environment to change, Students may be staying closer to home for a while. They may not want to be in a residential situation, although we're not seeing that as much. But what really changed was, in our view, how we deliver education. We've proven we can go remote and online more than our faculty ever thought they could. It's not ideal. It's not who we are as an institution, but we can't assume that there aren't going to be students out there who demand a different way of learning that we need to be cognizant of. So I think nearly normal is probably the term that needs more definition there, but I did think that number was a little high.
Yeah, sometimes we need to tighten up our language here in the survey to make sure it's. No, I agree. I agree with that sentiment completely. I think one of the things, sort of looking ahead, is that I think the Office of Finance has sort of been, I don't know if it's elevated, but sort of, I think more attention was provided to it, was given to it. As you thought about the recovery strategies from COVID. So I think there's more pressure than ever on the finance team to sort of be able to respond and understand the role is really expanding. And I think that sort of cross-functional collaboration is really key here, and that you've got to be able to respond quicker to business demands. So there's a lot more pressure being put on the Office of Finance. That's why we think the tools, making sure they have the right tools to do their jobs is so critical. And that also, I think it's just, finance is now more a part of the strategic conversation. I don't know if you agree with that or disagree with any of that sentiment.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I'll add one other thing to that too. I think what we're seeing a little bit of is there's the old saying that you never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And that's not something we're trying to do as a finance team, but what we're also seeing is some of our units are trying to be more aggressive in what they do. Which puts more pressure on us because we have to say, well, wait, that's a shortcut, or wait, you can't do that because we have to think about these downstream impacts. Because like a lot of finance functions in higher ed, and I'm moving away from the budget and planning side of this a little bit, but it's true. A lot of what happens out in the world, the world outside of our offices, ends up in our offices one way or another. And we just have to be ever diligent that as we're busy and we are reducing staff in the industry, that we're conscious of that. So I see two kinds of pressure. One is the pressure to make sure that we're not losing the compliance and accountability part of the job that we have to do, but also that we have to be able to deliver more better information quicker to the people who need to make decisions. So. And I won't say elevated as much too, Logan, but I will say, and we've been pretty highly regarded here at Xavier, just being engaged with senior leadership. So maybe it's not a fair comparison, but what I would say that we're more engaged than we would have been, maybe not at an elevated level, but just more of a frequency level, which I appreciate.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right there, and yeah, I mean, I completely agree. So I think I want to make sure we've got some time here for Q&A. So these are just, again, I think you're going to get the audience, you're going to get these slides. So these are just a few of the kind of takeaways, the high level recommendations. I believe we've touched on all of these as we've worked through the process. So at this point in the presentation, I'd really like to open it up to the audience for Q&A and see if Phil and I can provide any insights there.
Yep, definitely. Thank you. Thank you very much. As Logan was just saying, we now have some time for a Q&A where they can answer any of your questions. For those of you who have not yet submitted a question, you can please do so now by submitting the question in the Q&A panel, which should be located below the chat panel at the bottom of your screen. And if we don't get to your question today, the team at Centellus should be able to answer your questions privately after today's event. So it looks like this one question that just came in from Todd, looks like this one is for Phil, but he's asking, which stakeholders at Xavier, like a provost, the president, CFO, had the biggest aha moment when analyzing scenarios, and I guess going into what that aha moment was.
I don't know that anybody had an outlier aha moment, because give myself a little bit of credit here. I'd been telling them that we might be in for some challenges. So, and then we're looking at next year's forecast, for example. But I would say that I would say probably the biggest one was probably in the provost area, maybe enrollment management. They're separate, our institution. And I will be clear, we didn't make any decisions based solely, obviously, on that forecasted information. It became more of a discussion point. But I would probably say academic affairs to some degree, but also then just the enrollment management, because of their feeling that they'd been things were fine. And it really has to do with the fact that we're so tuition dependent. So.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. So the next question that we have that came in, it could be for both of you as well. What surprised you most from this survey?
Well, I'd have to say, I think maybe the level of optimism, September to November. I think maybe it was I think we said it was hopeful, right? And I want to be optimistic as well. But I thought that really surprised me a little bit. And then I don't know, Phil, anything stick out to you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also say that the one statistic where the number of schools using any sort of scenario modeling to make decisions, I thought I was a little surprised at how low that was. But those were probably the two biggest surprises I saw in the survey.
Yeah, that's a great point, Phil.
Perfect. Thanks. Before I get to this next question, I just want to remind everyone that we still have some time left in the Q&A. So if any more questions, please feel free to submit. Okay, so the next question. This one seems to be about how technology, it's only one part of the solution to adopt new practices. So with that in mind, what else should colleges and universities need to do to be more agile?
So outside of technology, I think one, transparency, I think is always helpful, right? And that comes with increased communication capabilities. So I think about, and I think maybe we had a slide on this, but the process, you've got to not just think about technology is only going to get you so far. You've got to build a process and sort of a culture around these processes and setting expectations correctly within your institution. And so those things kind of go hand in hand. I go into engagements with clients and say, if you're trying to just wrap a technology around a bad process, it'll help you a little bit, but I think you've got to really be honest with yourself about your process and take a deep look in the mirror there and try to adopt best practices.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you.
Yeah, I'll echo that, and I'll give you two quick examples for that as well. One is related specifically to forecasting and modeling, the long-range planning that we do. We would have never been able to do what we did with Syntellis and what we've adopted now had we not made the decision 2 years ago to move to a gap-based budget model, which prior to that, we had our budgeting done in the old fund accounting model, but all of our financial results, all of our audited statements, everything we showed the rating agencies was on a true gap basis. We had these huge disconnects in how money was spent. And the good thing was we didn't have a lot of spendthrifts across campus, but it was just wildly different numbers. And so one of the first changes I made was to move to that. And that was a big culture change, but it got people to start focusing on their operating funds and managing their restricted funds and internally designated funds differently. And so that was a big change that allowed us to adopt this long-range planning tool in a way that's been really beneficial for us. Had we not done that, we would have been on a longer path to get to where we are. But be that as it may, I think that was important, and we're still going through that. We still have some people that live in the old world, and we're trying to get them to change. Another example, completely unrelated to planning, was the way we were managing our capital spending processes. We're still tied to that old fund accounting model, and we didn't really have a good track on budget to actuals and capital spending and how things were approved. And how they were processed through our purchasing systems and how bidding was done. So we literally dissected that entire process. But what it's done for us is it saves so much time on the back end. But it was a process that in my corporate days, I could have just said, we're changing this. This is how we're doing it. But in my higher ed days, it takes a little bit more time to get everybody on board. As Logan laughs because he used to be at a large institution. But so we got all the people in a room and said, where does this work for you? Where does this doesn't work for you? And what, you know, typical project I thought would take 30 days took closer to 90 days. But that's another thing where I think we can't be afraid as finance leaders to tackle some of those things once and for all. But this will be a huge time saving on the back end. And it's all about getting everybody to understand what the goal is. And again, freeing up staff resources to focus on other things. We literally had a staff person who spent 80% of her time tracking down people in physical plants so they could approve payments for things we didn't even know they were buying. And that's now completely gone. So anyway, that's a long answer, but it's all about making sure you get the right people around the table and some upfront agreement on what you want to accomplish.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now we are at the top of the hour, so we'll just end here. But thank you again, Phil and Logan. You know, we really appreciate your time here today and sharing your expertise, and our audience appreciates it here as well. And again, if we didn't get the chance to answer your questions now, I'm sure the team at Centellus will be more than happy to get back to any of your questions following today on a private level. And with that said, I would also like to thank our attendees for joining today. For those of you who really enjoyed our presentation, there are many more upcoming web seminars like this one that are provided by us here at UB, which, as you know, is the leader of editorial coverage of news, trends, in addition to current issues in higher education. At our wide range of readers here subscribe for free to UB, and they stay up to date with us through our print magazine, the digital edition of our magazine, newsletters, including UB Daily, which is our daily newsletter, and web seminars like this one. Also, for those of you who would like to watch this web seminar again, or maybe for those of you who believe that the solutions that you saw today in this web seminar would be really helpful to your colleagues, you will be pleased to note that an archive recording of this web seminar will be available at the URL, which you can see on your screen here. And you can also expect to receive an email from the team here at UB at some point later tomorrow, which will include a link to all of the slides. So with that, on behalf of University Business, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone, and have a great spring semester. Take care, be well, and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thanks, everybody.